I'd first like to talk about Police Week. Today we observe Peace Officers Memorial Day, the heart of National Police Week. We all remember the men and women in law enforcement who have made the ultimate sacrifice. And we pause to say thank you to all of our police officers who work day and night to keep our communities safe. I want to share a special thanks to all our law enforcement members visiting from New York, who in my view are the gold standard in police work. I grew up in a neighborhood where police officers lived. I'd play with their children at their houses, and you'd always know, sort of instinctively, even as a kid, when that phone rang and the spouse, almost always in those days the wife of the police officer, heard the phone ring, always what went through her head a little bit is, I hope that's not the call I dreaded. This is the job of a police officer and their families, and that is to risk their safety for our safety. And they do a great job. And as we recognize their contributions, we should acknowledge what we could do in Congress to make their jobs safer and easier. We could make our streets safer by passing comprehensive background check legislation. We can help law enforcement combat foreign opioid trafficking by passing the Bipartisan Fentanyl Sanctions Act and the POWER Act, which provides handheld scanning devices. So when a police officer is on a drug bust, they can tell if fentanyl is part of the crime scene there, and they can take the precautions to protect themselves, because we know how deadly fentanyl is, even if it gets on your skin or in your nostrils. And we can also do more to care for the families of fallen officers. That's why I've been so proud to fight alongside my colleague, Senator Gillibrand, and so many others to make sure that the September 11th Victims' Compensation Fund has the necessary funding. Last Friday, the New York Police Department, NYPD, added the names of nearly 50 police officers to the 9/11 Memorial Wall, all of whom died in 9/11-related illnesses. It's our duty to take care of these families, and the first step is making sure that the Victims' Compensation Fund has enough funds to compensate them. So to our law enforcement officers, 2 words: thank you. Thank you for your service. It's an honor to represent you in the Senate, and we are all grateful for the sacrifices you make every day. Now on judges. During the same week that we mark the 65th anniversary of the historic Brown v. Board of Education, Leader McConnell has scheduled votes on nominees whose views directly contradict the spirit of equality and justice that Brown represents. It's appalling. These new people we are putting on the bench so turn the clock backwards after we've made so much progress, many of it through the courts. Consider the nomination of Michael Troncalli of Texas. He has peddled conspiracies of widespread voter fraud, once called President Obama an un-American imposter who, quote, bows to Arab sheiks and other world leaders. This is a man we're putting on the bench, a man who's supposed to be judicious, thoughtful, see both sides. What we're putting on the bench is hard-right ideologues who will do damage to this country for a generation. Mr. Troncalli was approved by the Republican Senate yesterday for a seat on the district court in Texas, and he's going to sit on that bench for life. A man who says things like this, who thinks like this. I've always tried to put on the bench people who are moderate. So many of us have. Bill Clinton did. Barack Obama did. And here we have a parade of narrow ideologues, and that's not who should be on the bench, because they will make law rather than interpret the law. Here's another one. Kenneth Lee of California. His past writings reveal shocking positions on race and diversity, affirmative action, education opportunity, women's reproductive freedom. He once wrote that multiculturalism is, quote, a malodorous sickness, and that sexism, which we've all seen and heard, and about a little more than half our population experiences, to be irrelevant pouting. That's a man who should be on the bench? Mr. Lee, if confirmed today, may preside over cases dealing with gender discrimination. And consider Wendy Vitter, nominated to the Eastern District. She once promoted the idea that contraceptives cause cancer and claimed that Planned Parenthood kills 150,000 women annually. She also refused to acknowledge that Brown v. Board was correctly decided, On this very anniversary, that's who's on the floor to be voted on in lockstep by all the folks here on the Republican side. She refused to acknowledge Brown v. Board was correctly decided, and saying instead the decision was correct with the benefit of hindsight, whatever that means. In the same district where 6-year-old Ruby Bridges became the first African-American child to attend an all-white elementary school in the South, the Senate will consider confirming someone who claimed hindsight was needed to understand why the decision that allowed Ruby to go to the same school as a white child was a correct one. That is who we're putting on the bench. These are not just conservatives. We understand the president, Republicans will put in conservatives, but hard right, narrow ideologues who show no understanding or sympathy for people who don't look like them or pray like them or marry like them. What is wrong here? It's not hard. If you need the benefit of hindsight to understand that Brown v. Board of Education, which brought an end to school segregation and led to the end of American apartheid, was correctly decided, you shouldn't be a federal judge. I urge my colleagues, in the spirit of the Brown anniversary and what it means, to oppose Ms. Vitter's nomination this afternoon. Now, in Puerto Rico, briefly, Mr. President, as negotiations on a final package of disaster aid continue, I want to stress to everyone that we must remain focused on reaching an agreement as swiftly as possible. Disaster-stricken Americans in the West, the South, the Midwest, and 3 million citizens of Puerto Rico are waiting on Congress to deliver relief, in some cases for disasters that occurred over a year ago. Well, why is this held up? We know why. Republicans were not willing to give aid to Puerto Rico, a bill that would never pass the House, and something they didn't think of originally. It was when President Trump said don't do it, and they just bowed down. And they thought that they could roll over the House, the Democratic minority in the Senate, who wouldn't stand up for certain Americans. Well, we did. And now, thankfully, we're making progress. Republicans are realizing that Puerto Ricans cannot be left out of the package. But now we must avoid poison pills at all costs. President Trump, if he sticks his thumb into this again and asks for something unreasonable, will delay disaster aid once again, just as he did once. So to my Republican colleagues, let's do this together. Let's do it in the right way. Let's do it in a way that can pass the House. And President Trump will sign the bill. We've got to make sure this legislation gets across the finish line, and every time the president intervenes and Republican colleagues go along, it gets held up even further. On the Alabama abortion bill, last night the Republican Alabama Senate passed perhaps the most draconian abortion law in the country. It bans abortion at every stage of pregnancy, imposes criminal penalties on any doctor who performs one, and includes no exception in the case of rape or incest, even if the victim is a child. A child is raped, have to have the baby. The Alabama bill is as extreme as it gets. It's a clear attack on women's freedom. It contravenes a woman's constitutional right to make private medical decisions. It would deeply harm women, turn doctors into criminals, deny the right of rape victims, even if they're children, to make personal medical decisions. The Alabama abortion bill is plainly inhumane. It should never have passed. The governor should not sign it, and if she does, it ought to be swiftly struck down by the courts. And on Iran, over the past few days, it's come to light in public reporting that the Trump administration's national security team has reviewed a plan to deploy as many as 120,000, yes, you heard that right, 120,000 U.S. troops in the Mideast, should tensions with Iran escalate. I was stunned to read this report in the New York Times yesterday. The administration just started a maximum pressure campaign of sanctions against Iran. But is it simultaneously reviewing plans for war? That would make no sense. The president, meanwhile, oddly denied the report while also saying he would absolutely send ground troops to the Middle East. But if he did, it would be a heck and I'm paraphrasing, of a lot more troops than 120,000. Did we learn the lessons of the last decade? Do we know that we have to spend our time focusing on building up this country? Here? Not build roads and bridges in the Middle East, but do them here? Well, there's an alarming lack of clarity here. There's a lack of strategy, and there's a lack of consultation. The President ought to come up with a strategy and make it clear to Congress. An adventure like this, 120,000 troops or a large number of troops, should have to be approved by the Congress. It certainly should be discussed with the Congress ahead of time. There need to be open hearings and closed briefings with the committees of jurisdiction immediately. Any potential increase in our military presence in the Middle East should require consultation with Congress, and anything beyond that would require this body to act. President Trump, what is your strategy? Where are you headed, and why aren't you talking to Congress about it? And finally, on public housing. It was reported last week that the Department of HUD has proposed a rule that would bar families with mixed immigration status from receiving public housing assistance, even if everyone but one member of the family are legal residents. So if it's a family of 6, a mother who's an American citizen, 4 children who are American citizen, but a husband who is not, and not here legally, they'd kick them all out. It risks displacing tens of thousands of legal residents, of American citizens, including 55,000 children. The administration has created crisis after crisis with the immigration community. Are they going to create another one and take 55,000 young American children, almost all of whom are citizens, and just kick them out on the streets when we know there's very little affordable housing? What a cruel and callous policy. It's another example of the Trump administration's desire to separate families and disrupt communities. There's nothing to say about this proposed rule but that it is cruel, wrong-headed, and will lead to even more chaos than the administration has created already. In an effort to appear even more punitive towards immigrants, the administration has conjured up a rule that could potentially force tens of thousands of children into homelessness or away from their families. So my message to President Trump and Secretary Carson is simple. Scrap this idea now. I yield the floor.